but I'd like to, on behalf of Stork Valley Rotary, welcome Nick Tatchell, who is going to talk to us about We Must Stop Meeting Like This. Nick has a lot of experience in organisational culture, but I'll let him explain a bit more about what that means. And also from an environmental perspective, you couldn't time this talk any better with COP26, literally to some of us just around the corner. So without further ado, I will hand over to Nick and you have control.
Thank you, Jim. I've got a couple of screens going, so I will just see how we do in sharing the right one. Otherwise, goodness knows what you will see. Let's see how we do. Okay. So you'll either see yourselves or you'll see, is it full screen, everybody?
Yes, that's good.
It is. Excellent. Every time you use Zoom, you have to do something slightly different to get it to do what you want it to do, don't you? Which is all very, very strange. But it's lovely to see you all, meet you all. I'm sure I'm dialing in from the furthest away for this meeting, but it's really nice to join you. Very much. I wonder if I could ask if you're not for people to put themselves on mute. I'm getting a little bit of feedback in I'm hearing myself, which is always.
Neil, Nick, you need to unmute yourself now.
There we go. Is that okay? Okay, good. So this is going to be a little bit of a wander through a few topics that I'm seeking somehow in my recent research and now also consulting career to try and pull together. As the title of the talk implies, that this is going to be around virtual meetings. It is going to be around how we connect with each other, particularly in the sphere of business. It's also going to obviously be around air travel, as the sort of the subtitle of the talk will explain. And I suppose the best way of describing why I'm interested in this is what you're seeing here on the screen, which I think is just my kind of brief summary slide of what I'm involved with. And as Jim said, I now have recently founded a one-person consulting organization based in the Highlands of Scotland called NetZero.Work. And the idea of NetZero.Work, or the mission of NetZero.Work, is to help organizations think about how they can help their employees, motivate their employees, encourage their employees, enable their employees to work not only for customers, for shareholders, for their bosses, but also work for the planet. Hence the strapline or the tagline of my consulting firm, which is working for the planet. And the thinking around that is, if businesses are to achieve their goals of net zero, which many of them, of course, are setting net zero targets now. I think around a third, 38%, I think it is, of the FTSE 100 now have some sort of reasonably robust targets to achieve net zero carbon emissions. That affects all that they do. That affects the way that they interact, obviously, with suppliers. It affects how where they buy their energy from. It affects how they think about policies, processes. All of those things are very, very important. For some, it'll fundamentally reshape their business. You know, if you keep an eye on the news, you'll see how companies like Shell and BP, Ørsted in Scandinavia is really having to think hard about their business models. So that's we can't get away from the fact that businesses are going to have to change significantly in those more, I suppose, processy, technical aspects. But my position is they're going to have to think very hard about the culture of their organizations as well. They're going to have to think about, as I said, how they enable their employees, if you like, to do the right thing, not only for their bosses and customers, but also for the planet. My background is in organizational psychology. I worked for 20 years for a company called Willis Towers Watson. Most of what I did at at Willis Towers Watson was in doing employee research. So it's based on survey-based, employee survey-based, generating data on organizational culture, leadership style. Sometimes it was with a specific focus, let's say around safety and safety culture, or risk and risk culture. So I'm really seeking now to lift and drop that in a very specific area, which is around a culture for sustainability. And really, this is a slightly long introduction, is to say that in some ways the focus of tonight isn't so much about air travel, important though that is, and I will discuss, there will be a chance to discuss and ask questions as well about business-related air travel. But it's more, in a sense, using air travel as a pretext or context for discussing the broader issue of how do we create workplaces where employees can do the right thing for the climate, and help their organizations achieve net zero goals. Very specifically around air travel. Now, air travel actually isn't a huge part of most organizations' carbon footprint. It is, however, a very large part of organizations' carbon footprint that work in the professional services arena, which is my own background. And I would imagine, living in Bishop Stortford or the area, that maybe some of you have financial services experience as well. And for those companies as well, business air travel is quite a large chunk of their carbon emissions. So it seems to make sense to focus in on this, both in its own right. In other words, can we help organizations reduce the amount of business air travel that they do, but also as a way in to discuss the broader issue around creating organizational cultures that can help businesses achieve their net zero goals. So we'll do a little bit of a meander through those subjects over the next 35 or 40 minutes, I would say. I don't know if you're seeing it. I've got a slight issue with the font sizes. I don't know if that's coming out with you as well, but we're going to press on anyway. Does it look okay to you? Slide 3, has that come up now?
I'm still on slide 1.
Oh, really?
Mm.
That's not so good, is it? Okay, let's try.
That's 2, that's 3, yeah, but it's not quite maximized.
No. Okay,
but that's okay.
I thought we were on. Okay, see, I've got slideshow up. Let's see if we can switch around. I'll just take a couple of seconds to see if I can share the actual slide that you see. Is that now full screen? Any better?
Yes, it's full screen, yeah. And it's
okay.
Fine.
Yeah, okay. All right, so a little bit around air travel at first, the background and why we're studying this, a little bit about why focus on business air travel, and then a little bit about the research that I'm doing. And this is the Anglia Ruskin part. In my role as a visiting research fellow at Anglia Ruskin University's Global Sustainability Institute, I am doing some specific research. I'd love to come to you with some fully formed, beautifully thought through analysis and findings. You'll see that this, at the end, this is part 1 of a talk. The research is ongoing. I should have some data over the next few months, so hopefully come back maybe in a year or so with some findings. That would be very much the hope. But I'll give you at least a flavour of what I'm talking about, what I'm researching, and we'll take it from there. Now, in terms of aviation and climate change itself, how does one influence the other? Well, in total, 2018 data, so pre-COVID, we had aviation as a whole was responsible for around 7% of the UK's carbon emissions. Travel as a whole is around 24%, I believe. So aviation is responsible for about roughly a quarter of the travel emissions, carbon emissions, but only actually 7% of the overall carbon emissions. And the issue with aviation is that it's going to be pretty hard to reduce. There is a number of technical solutions that can be applied in other industries that are so-called easier to abate. The one most obvious one, I'm sure you're all familiar with, being energy, and the opportunity to generate energy in a more sustainable or a more environmentally or renewable way. It's harder to do that for aviation. Now, so what that means is that as other sectors reduce their carbon emissions, energy being the great example, the proportion that is captured, or the proportion that is accounted for by the aviation sector will indeed increase. So, and added to that, aviation has been a growth industry. Now, of course, we're looking at a period, and I'll show you in a couple of minutes slides that show you the impact of COVID on aviation and on air travel. But broadly speaking, apart from the blip that we're seeing, major blip due to COVID, it is expected to rise. So if pre-COVID air travel growth trends return, according to the International Civil Aviation Authority, CO2 emissions from international aviation could triple by 2050 unless there is some action taken to obviously reduce that. Indeed, as I said, as other industries, other sectors reduce their carbon emissions, by 2050, aviation could consume 1/4 of what's called the total global carbon budget. That's an amount that's been calculated by scientists as being the total amount of CO2 that we can emit into the atmosphere if we are to keep, and at the same time, keeping global warming at plus 1.5 degrees, which is the Paris Agreement aspiration. So even though it's a relatively small part of the total pie at the moment, it will grow over time. A few other stats for you. Interestingly, 15% of people take 70% of all UK flights. Again, pre-COVID data, but sometimes air travel is thought of as a wonderfully democratizing thing, and in some ways that is true. You know, it is. It's great in some ways that people can travel cheaply, and you don't have to be, a multimillionaire to fly EasyJet at all. So in some ways it is a democratizing experience, but actually when you look at the data, there's a relatively small percentage of the population who do take the majority of flights, which is an interesting point from a more justice angle. You might want to think about that or discuss that. And the technical, I won't go into huge detail on the technical, potential technical solutions to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from flights. But in a sense, we're at a situation where there is no what's called a green plane. There's no green plane waiting in the wings. It's not that we have a very ready to launch, massively scalable solution, a technical solution where we're seeing costs dramatically starting to plummet, that will enable aviation to solve its carbon emissions issues through technology and through innovation. Yes, we've got sustainable aviation fuels. Yes, there are some interesting and quite exciting experiments going on around battery-powered planes, even looking at hydrogen power. But these are quite far down the line. These are still quite early innovations. And given that we really have to get carbon emissions down rapidly, it's just not. The aviation is one of those harder to abate sectors, so-called. So my position is that to reduce aviation emissions, which I think for the purpose of tonight, I'm going to say we need to do. Let's take that as read, particularly with COP26 ringing in our ears a lot at the moment. There needs to be a holistic approach. We don't have a quick fix technical solution, so there will need to be policy intervention. There will need to be ongoing and rapidly, at pace, technical innovation. But we must think about the role of behaviour change as well in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from aviation. Now, and then, of course, I'm aware of where most of you live. I'm aware that probably most of you have planes flying overhead all the time, and you're maybe some of you have some. Maybe you've worked at Stansted or have businesses that provide Stansted. So I have to be a little careful in what I say. But probably I can't tell people who live near Stansted too much about potentially some of the other impacts of aviation, both in terms of, for example, noise, disturbance, impact of airport development as well. So whereas now we're focusing on the greenhouse gas emissions, we do have to think about whether actually reducing the amount of flying that people do could have other side benefits as well. Interestingly, where I used to live in Welwyn, much closer to Luton, and when they were discussing, as they have been recently, the need to expand Luton Airport, it was interesting how the environmental impact, or the potential environmental impact, was far higher on the list of reasons for not being against the Luton Airport expansion. We wouldn't have seen that, I don't think, 3 or 4 years ago. I said I'd talk a little bit about what has happened to air travel during COVID. This is data from Eurocontrol, which oversees air travel, air traffic across mostly member states in Europe. And this slide is just tells in data the story that, in a sense, we all know, which is how dramatically air travel declined as a result of the of lockdowns in response to the pandemic. So what we're seeing here is data that basically each day is a tiny little light blue line running from March 13th, 2020, which is around the time that lockdowns were starting to be applied across Europe, pretty much through to the present day. So the latest data on Eurocontrol website is October 18th, so roughly a week or so ago. The thin blue lines are actual numbers of flights being taken in the Eurocontrol area across 43 member states, and the thicker blue line that runs up here and blips a little bit around Christmas last year is the 7-day moving average. So in essence, you're seeing the same data, just what one is the individual days and one is the moving average over 7 days. And what this is telling us, as we go to the right-hand side, is that as of effectively a week ago, across the Eurocontrol area, there was still 27% fewer flights happening than there were just before pandemic hit. So it has recovered, but it is still below previous rates. Now, of course, this is across numerous countries. This is essentially all flights, not sort of small private aircraft. This is more commercial and cargo and passenger flights. It is still below, but it has actually, as you can see, it's definitely starting to recover. So that's up to pretty much the present day. Eurocontrol also do and update on fairly regular basis their forecasts for flights. They fairly recently introduced or released a forecast running up right the way through to 2027 for actual IFR movements. I'm tempted to ask my brother what IFR means. I think it means instrument flight regulation. So these are flights that need some sort of interaction with instruments in order to fly. So anything that's even a small commercial jet would come under an IFR regime. So essentially all flights, the kind of things that you see taking off from and landing at Stansted day by day. So what we're seeing here are data from 2019 through to 2027. This is the decline that we saw in 2020, down from 11.1 million movements per year down to 5 million movements per year. And what they've done from 2021 onwards is basically modeled what they believe the return of flight movements will be. And this is the interesting number. This is the 100%. This is when in 2024 they would expect that flight movements will return to what was the 2019 level. So if you think about it, we're now late 2021. We're still, according to the data, at around 56, perhaps a little bit higher. Well, we're probably somewhere in here, aren't we? Sort of heading up towards maybe 70% total across the whole region, and they're expecting to get back up to 100% in 2024. So that would suggest that actually COVID, yes, it's got us thinking quite hard and acting in very different ways when it comes to to flights across the spectrum, whether it's business flights, whether it's visiting family and friends or holidays. Of course, we've had to think and act in very, very different ways. But this doesn't suggest that there has been a COVID, if you like, a COVID long-term impact, that there will be a recovery of flights back to levels and even above levels that we saw in 2019. I think for a second, I've actually completely lost your faces, so I can't even tell if you're still listening. What I will do is just come out of this for a second and just see if there are any questions or comments at this point. So if we can come out of mute.
I think if anyone has a question, then if you could please raise your hand, and then I'll bring you in. So let me just make sure. Peter Latham, I notice your hand is waving. So if you'd like to tell us what your question is, Peter.
I've unmuted myself. Yes, I'm surprised that the fall in flights as of now, and even the projections for that matter, but certainly is only of the order of 25%. My observation, living quite close to Stansted Airport, which is admittedly predominantly a holiday airport, or at least a larger proportion on average, probably are holiday makers from Stansted and other London or other UK airports. And when I travel, as I do from time to time, to drop people off at Stansted, the place is empty. So observing what goes on, I would guess, and I'm obviously wrong, but I would guess that so far as Stansted and the flights from Stansted, the flights are way below 50% of what we normally would have expected before COVID. Am I completely wrong, or is there some distortion around holiday travels?
I think you've picked up on a, yes, that's a very, I think it's a valid view. I don't have data for individual airports. That would be very interesting. And I'm sure you would see differences in the more, I suppose the interesting thing for Stansted though, is that the cargo flights have not decreased to the same extent. And Stansted, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, has quite a strong cargo.
Yes, no, the cargo has stayed pretty well the same. It's
I think
the Ryanair flights which have fallen away.
Yes. I think that would be true. So let's, at the risk, I mean, this is being recorded, so at the risk of being proved horribly wrong, but I would imagine that in certain airports that are more holiday based, that the 27% is in fact higher. And I'm hearing, I haven't flown for a while, but my daughter has, and other friends, that they are experiencing a much quicker track through an airport than they would have done pre-COVID. So I would expect that to be higher. I think it is just, this is an average. It does include the cargo flights. It does include other types of flights. I think people are starting to play catch up a little bit. So they are starting to, if they haven't been able to see friends or family for 2 years, then boy, they're going to go and visit that grandchild that's been born and they haven't seen, you know. So there's a lot of catch up going on. So I think that's what's causing that bounce back to be perhaps more than perhaps you're sensing out there on the ground, under the air, as it were.
Yeah. Thank you. Neil Kirby, would you like to, I think you're unmuted, so
yes,
fire ahead, fire away.
Thank you, Jim. Hi, Nick.
Hi.
I don't know whether you would happen to know. I was just curious about the comparison with air traffic with, say for example, with driving a domestic car. Is there research which shows how the two compare, and how many miles you would have to drive in your car to have to make the equivalent damage to the climate of say one kind of overseas flight?
There is. I can't quote it to you. I'd love to have it to hand. I think from memory though, it was quite scary when I saw it. It was driving through most of Europe. Certainly any kind of transatlantic flight was a significant. It was something like your expected average mileage, you know, in an average family car. I think that is why it's interesting how, and again, apologies if anyone is in aviation and come back to me, but often people in aviation say, look, why are we picking on aviation when actually it is a relatively small part? Why are you picking on concrete making, which actually contributes just as much? And I think that's one of the issues is the personal versus the corporate. So for an individual, such as a lot of individuals, in about half of people in the UK took a flight. This is pre-COVID, but about half of people took a flight. For each individual, it is quite a large part of your carbon footprint, each flight that you take. So from a personal perspective, it's something that you can do quite quickly and quite easily to not fly, to take a train to Inverness to come and visit us, or whatever it is. As an individual, it's something that you can quite easily do. Then you get into the debate as well, actually, is it just individual action that will get us to net zero? And of course it's not. We have to do so many other things, but as individuals, it is something that we can potentially do that would help get to net zero, as long as businesses and governments and all the rest of them doing the same. Otherwise, frankly, we don't stand a chance.
Could I offer some information?
Just before James, just before I come to you, I've had a very quick look, and per kilometre, a domestic flight uses 154 grams of emissions, whereas a car per kilometre is 254 versus 171. So going in a car is much less of an impact in terms of emissions than going on a flight.
And do you have the numbers of trains, Jim?
Yeah, a train is 41. So right down 41 grams instead of 171 for a car with one passenger in it, or 254 for a flight. So, I mean, the difference is quite striking.
Okay. Thank you, Jim.
James, you were going to ask a question.
No, I was going to offer some information, which is that transatlantic flights these days, planes provide about 108 miles per gallon per passenger mile. 108 miles per gallon per passenger for a jet aircraft. Obviously, if you're going to do short haul, that decreases. You're talking about the CO2 footprint, but if you're getting 100 miles to the gallon, it's quite efficient. One of the questions I was going to ask at the end of Nick was how the relative costs of aircraft compares with, for example, trains, which not only do they consume less energy for the actual train, but the upkeep of the track, and for roads, the upkeep of the roads themselves. All these incidentals are not necessarily figured into a lot of the calculations that are provided these days. So it is a huge minefield. But I was quite impressed with how many miles to the gallon per passenger you get out of an aircraft.
And absolutely. So, and one of the innovations is, and that the airline industry is relying on, is increasing efficiency, not only of the aircraft themselves, but also of flight patterns that you may have seen around this, that trying to reduce the amount of time that they spend hovering or circling around your houses would be a good thing. So there are definitely things that the industry can do, and hats off to them, because right now it's an industry under deep financial strain. So if they are continuing to invest in these things, then that has to be good. Okay, yes, they end up saving money because they're also using less fuel. So what's not to like? But yes, you're right. Any calculation of greenhouse gas emissions does need to think of the round. I think it's interesting, and this is an aside, and I'm aware of time, but we need to be careful. It's very interesting how so many people in the environmental movement are against HS2, which is a whole new topic, and not one I'm very familiar with. But one of the reasons is not just the destruction of large swathes of beautiful countryside, but actually the carbon cost of building the thing. So you do have to be careful. I agree with you with that, James, on how these things are measured. But
just to chip in, I mean, that's a really relevant and important factor, because we all know that concrete doesn't grow on trees. And if you've got your finger on Twitter Pulse, you'll know what I'm referring to. But just very quickly, I think we can take Colin's. Colin, you had something to ask, and then we should probably move on with the rest of
Okay.
the talk.
Okay.
Colin, would you like to?
I was
Go for
quite
it.
quick, really. I was wondering what proportions of air movements are actually in the three main areas. One is obviously holiday travel. The second one is clearly the business travel, and the third one is sort of cargo movements. And I wondered, because I guess what you're going to talk about will apply to the business portion.
Yes.
I wondered what proportion that was of the total.
It's by far the smallest. So I think the latest, it depends on countries, and I'm picking the number, the deep recesses, it's around 10 to 12%. This is pre-COVID, obviously. I don't know the split between the other two areas. I just know that business travel is relatively small. So again, it's one of these, how do we look at this? For a lot of businesses, it is one of their largest emitters. As I said, I'm picking on business travel with a little bit of a pretext to look at broader issues around, creating organizations that help employees work for the planet. But actually, in and of itself, if we get business travel down to zero, it's not going to get us to net zero. There's a lot of other things we need to be doing. Okay, I probably need to move on, if that's all right. But thank you for your really interesting and valid comments and questions. One of the other, let me just restart, resume sharing. I'm just going to share some other data for you. You should see a slide that says, will there be fewer business flights and more Zoom calls in future? Has that popped up?
Not just yet. It still just says that you've.
Okay.
Oh, here we go. There we are. Thank you.
Okay, so just a little bit of a digression. We are a bit of a holding pattern at the moment. I just share with you some research, survey-based research by YouGov, taken, I believe, in April this year. So again, things move quickly, but this is reasonably recent, about what business travelers are saying about their own intent to fly. So essentially what they found in this YouGov research across Europe is that they're expecting that around 4 in 10 business travelers plan to fly less after COVID. So their experience of living with in a world of Zoom calls, of team calls, has led them 4 in 10 to say, yeah, we expect that will somehow embed new ways of working going forward that will result in fewer flights. So, and just in terms of the actual numbers, just to call them out, hopefully they're clear enough on the screen. Around 38% said we're going to take roughly the same number of flights. 40%, as we see here, said they're going to take fewer. For whatever reason, 13% said they're going to take more flights. And in the same survey, they asked what their companies are planning to do. Are their companies taking steps to reduce emissions? And roughly the same, about 4 in 10 said companies are trying to reduce their emissions, which of course is great in the sense that 5 years ago, that number would probably have been in single figures. Whereas still there's work to do, because 38% said their company had no plans for doing this. And some other more recent report, actually, there was a McKinsey report, I think, from maybe September this year, so relatively recent, called The Comeback of Corporate Travel. And I'll give you the link there to the report itself if you want to go into a bit more detail. They actually predict a full recovery of corporate travel by 2024. So not only the big picture Eurocontrol across the whole sector travel data that I showed you earlier, recovering by 2024, they expect recovery of corporate travel by 2024 as well. This is interesting because they also report a large percentage of companies adopting new working arrangements after COVID. So 72% of companies adopting permanent remote working arrangements. I'm sure you're all familiar yourself or with colleagues or family members who are able to work in a more flexible remote style. We had our daughter up here for 2 weeks. She works for a company based in London, but she was up here in Ullapool, sitting where I'm sitting, working quite happily, because her company has basically allowed her to work from wherever. And indeed, many organizations and many employees are saying, look, we don't need as many in-person meetings as before. Yes, some of us feel very zoomed out by meetings like this. Some of us are desperate to get back to the sort of the experience of face-to-face meetings that we felt we've lost during the pandemic. But actually, we are thinking quite hard about the need for so many in-person meetings. And 48% of companies say they will focus more on environmental impact of travel. And that might mean three things. Either we travel less frequency, we move to other travel modes, such as the train rather than the plane, or we establish more rigorous approval processes. In other words, we establish a clearer, more robust travel policy that really challenges the need for people to travel as much. So that was interesting. I thought that many organizations are looking hard at that. And they also identify what they talk as 4 different business travel profiles. So these represent, if you like, the total travel body, the total population of business travelers, and they're putting them into 4 different of boxes or segments. 15% are those who basically carried on traveling through the pandemic. They, for whatever reason, they had to or they could continue to travel. They never left, in a sense. They never left the airport. They never left the planes. 20%, they reckon, are never going to return. So they are going to take, they are going to follow different travel modes, make different decisions about air travel. They're going to try and reduce their air travel. What's interesting for me is the 60% that they classify as being the fear of missing out brigade. And I think that is at the heart of what's driving the return, perhaps not only of business travel, but of travel overall, but maybe it's more specifically for business. If I don't travel to meet my clients, then my competitors will. If I don't travel to that pitch to present my company, then my competitors do. Then I won't get the work. So in a sense, what's creating the return to business travel is the fact that I think someone else is traveling. You know, my competitor, particularly. So if I don't travel, then I'm going to miss out. Which makes sense to me. I think I've been in the consulting world for over 20 years, and I know the worst thing that you can do is not make enough effort to win a sale or not make enough effort to support or to make a client feel like they're the most important people in the world. And a lot of that in the past is represented by traveling to be with them, sometimes with justifiable reasons. So I think from a consulting or a financial services or business services perspective, a lot of what will drive the reduction in business air travel will be if the clients themselves say, actually, we want to have an open and honest conversation with you as our supplier about whether you need to travel as much to see us. Perhaps we'd like to see you at the start, perhaps we'd like to see you at the end, but frankly, apart from that, we do not want you on our premises. We want to be able to operate in this way, in a virtual way, because we are trying to reduce our carbon emissions just as much as you, supplier, are or should be. So the clients themselves have a very important role to play. I'm just going to change tack and move through the next bit fairly quickly, because I think I've talked a bit about this, but I'm just going to move on to talk more about the reasons why personally I'm drawn to this topic, which is why study business air travel from a culture and behavior perspective. I mentioned at the start that I've been in consulting. A lot of my work was helping organizations understand their culture, understand what is driving the behavior, the good, the bad, and the ugly of their employees. So for me, business air travel is a very interesting topic to study. And for these reasons, I'll just talk them through very, very quickly, but you can read them for yourselves. In a sense, the primary purpose, the primary reason is that I believe the climate crisis will call for behavior change in all areas of life, some minor, but some major. That includes our work life. That's the first reason. The second reason is that actually there is an increasing focus on the role of companies in getting to net zero. Yes, there's been a lot of focus on certain sectors, talked about them, the energy sector being an obvious example. There's a lot of focus on consumers, on us as individuals and communities, on what we can do to live in a more environmental or a more green fashion, if you like. But actually the role of companies is becoming increasingly under the spotlight, and there are some very powerful voices speaking to companies, speaking to the finance sector, like Mark Carney, former Bank of England governor, being very, very strident in some of his statements about the role of business, the role of finance in achieving net zero. So there is increasing spotlight on that. Honing in even further, one of the reasons that I'm particularly interested in this area is because a lot of this is where I'm going to sound a little bit more researchy, a little bit more academic, but a lot of what typically drive or typically predict from an academic perspective, what we call pro-environmental behavior. Some of these predictors, some of these enablers, if you like, of pro-environmental behavior may be constrained or may be conflicted when we look at these drivers in the workplace. And I've listed a few of them here. So typically we find that when people, perhaps in a consumer environment, when they feel able to make their own choice of travel mode, they will often decide to choose less environmentally damaging or more environmentally friendly modes of travel. In the workplace, often that empowerment is taken away from us. We don't have that choice. Another thing that typically creates, if you like, an environment of pro-environmental behavior is when it's very clear where responsibility lies. If I personally am clear that I can take this action and it will have this desired effect, i.e. it will reduce my carbon footprint, then I will take that action. I feel a sense of responsibility for it. Will make me more likely to act. At work, often decisions around travel mode aren't clear. Is it me? Do I have freedom to make this decision? Is it my boss who's going to say, you know, you must go up to Aberdeen to meet with this client? Is it my company, i.e. our travel policy? Or, as I touched on earlier, is it my clients? When everyone is responsible, the saying goes, no one is responsible. So decisions to act differently are often not made. Decisions to not fly are often not made. We just carry on with business as usual, and we carry on flying as usual. A couple of others that come up often, if you have quite strong pro-environmental values, often they can conflict with other values or ways of acting at work. For example, your desire to be a good boss who visits their colleagues who might work on different sites. Or, of course, you're very ambitious, you want to get on at work, and you want to be seen to be effective. Or some people actually just enjoy business travel. For them, it's one of the perks of the job. So there are numerous reasons why it's valuable to study business air travel from a culture and behavior perspective, because a lot of the drivers of pro-environmental behavior, things that create pro-environmental behavior, are muddied, are conflicted or constrained at work. And staying somewhat in the academic front, I will again just talk this through fairly quickly, but you can come back if you have any questions. There are numerous domains, numerous dimensions, numerous things surrounding us, as well as attitudes and our own personal ways of acting that affect how we behave at work. Yes, we bring our own personal attitudes. As I said, we may want to be more, to fly less, because we believe it will reduce carbon emissions, which is a good thing. We may so there's all the personal attitudes, personal ways of acting, what we call personal norms, that come into play. But there are also these aspects on the left-hand side. There are organizational norms, organizational habits, I sometimes call them. Ways of operating that are the accepted ways of operating, policies, procedures, but also leadership example plays a role. All these aspects, all these things can come into play to influence our behavior at work, indeed can influence a decision whether to fly to a meeting or not. And I've given you some quotes there as well. I like the first one. Behavior in organizations is not only influenced by personal values, beliefs, and norms, but especially by contextual factors. And sometimes we don't notice these. It's like the water we swim in. We don't really notice, especially when we've been in an organization for many years, we don't notice that it has certain values, it has certain ways of working, certain habits that may constrain or may encourage certain behavior, sometimes good and sometimes less good. And that for me is fascinating. That's what was really got me going in my previous career, and also why I'm fascinated to do this study going forward. And I love this quote. It's from a book called The Psychology of Green Organizations, and it's a section of that book. And this is very much where I want to do research and consult in the future. It's about, you may struggle a little bit with the terminology about greening organizations. I think the idea is, how do we create environments where within organizations that are driving carbon emissions down, driving less waste in the system, driving better use of resources. We need to think in a systems way. We need to understand that human behavior is embedded within a system, an organizational system. And the role perhaps of leaders, I think it's a huge leadership challenge, is to remove organizational or technological barriers and make sure that the system is supportive of intended behaviors and culture. As I said at the very start, I want organizations to be, and their employees not only to be working for their customers, for their bosses, for their shareholders, for their owners, but also for the planet. And that might mean that we have to think very hard about the system, including the culture that we create in our organizations. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to jump through and just give you a little bit about the research and the state of play of the research. My plan is to, well, I've already started. I've got one organization already running the survey, and I've been looking for organizations typically in the financial or professional services world, because for them, as I said, carbon emissions are, or aviation is quite a large chunk of their overall carbon dioxide emissions. So these are the kind of companies that I'm targeting. There is interest in connecting culture and HR practices to sustainability, which I think is a good thing. So I'm really trying to foster and encourage that. So the survey is in the field. I'll give you just, apologies, the text is a little bit small, but this just gives you a bit of an idea of some of the things I'm trying to tease out from the survey. And this is based on a research model that's been applied to the world of organizations. As you can see, a lot of these are quite soft. A lot of them are quite, you know, that they're around people's behaviors, people's sort of embedded attitudes and beliefs. They're not so much about policies and processes and technology, because that's the soft stuff that is often called the hard stuff in organizations. So I wonder, as you look through these questions, there's just one other slide to come. But this perhaps is a good place just to, as you read through these questions, just think about maybe current or previous workplaces that you've lived in. I'd love to hear whether any of these really resonate with you in your previous work experiences. Think, for example, of the questions here on social norm. My manager or my senior leader, would they disapprove if I say I do not want to fly to a meeting because of the impact of flying on climate change? There are some organizations I know that would seriously have an issue with me as an employee were I to say that, were I to take a stand, and, you know, personal stand, but personal values, not to fly to a meeting. They would say, well, sorry, but the client always comes first, for example. I'll just show you the second set of questions as well. And then, as I said, if there are any thoughts or responses, particularly to maybe how you would answer these questions in a current or previous career working experience, would be interesting to hear. apart from that, I am open to further questions, comments, reflections.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. That's been really thought-provoking and has certainly taken me drifting off to the days when I had a proper job and used to have to go and see people, and actually quite a lot of those times I didn't have any discretion at all. I was just told to go somewhere and I'd go there, and that was, you know, that was kind of expected of everybody. And the top bosses would say, well, you've got to go to Zurich or Frankfurt or New York or wherever, and you just kind of think, oh, well, I'll go there then. And it was never really thought of from an environmental perspective. I think that has changed a lot in recent years, as has people's ability to work remotely, as you touched on, and to use technology like this, where we're all in a virtual room, which even a couple of years ago, none of us would have really believed this was going to be happening. So I think the time is absolutely right to be thinking about these questions. And I think things have definitely moved on to an extent. It would be very interesting to see how some of the firms that I'm thinking of up the railway line here, and I do mean a railway line because it's only London, are behaving and how they're changing. And I'd be really interested to hear what you discover and what you turn up. So thank you again very much for that. I'm just looking to see if anyone has their hand up with any thoughts or comments or suggestions or ideas on top. I think Tony Stringer was quickest on the draw. Well done, and you win today's prize of going first. You have to unmute yourself, please, Tony.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. What you're saying challenges the sort of motivational and other factors which I was teaching and have been teaching for 10 years. It seems to me that the sort of traditional models, and I won't quote any names, changed quite dramatically as a result of what you're talking about and the thoughts that are coming forward. You know, you go back and we're still teaching, this may mean nothing to anybody else, but people like Maslow and Hertzberg and all those sort of people, that theory has to change, doesn't it? We need a new set of theories in terms of the management of an organization, which will result in people not feeling they need to travel or not regard travel as a perk, if you like, of the job, as you know, as a lot of people do. I know. The second point is there a role for Rotary in all of this? Can we participate in any of your surveys? I'm sure that we'd all be delighted to, and you've had some comments already this evening.
I would be very open to that. I think the only criteria that I've set for taking part in the survey is that you're working within an organization, so you have experience of current experience of how your interaction is with your manager, what your senior leaders are saying about the climate, some of the perhaps the pressures or the tensions that you feel around how climate change is talked about at work or how sustainability is talked about at work. But certainly through Jim, if anyone is interested in finding out more, I could share more details on the survey, Tony. So thank you for that, for making that mention. I should have made it myself. And just very briefly on your first point, I think you're right. I think that said, I think the best theories build on the strengths of previous theories. So I would say it's an iteration rather than as a denouncement of what's gone in.
It wasn't meant as a denouncement, but I would say the theories need to grow, need to be modified.
And I would agree with you on that. Yes. Thank you.
Peter Blaskos, would you like to unmute yourself, Peter?
There we are. You can hear me now. Yeah, declare an interest. I used to be the manager of the aviation market for BP many, many years ago. So we had a particular interest in getting our estimates right, in that my guys, we used to build all the hydrant systems on airports in the UK, and that it implies getting the volume right, size of aircraft right, also building the pipelines to supply the airports in the first place, for example, Gatwick. And so we had a sort of rules of thumb to estimate demand, and our rule of thumb then was every passenger carried with him or her 20 gallons of fuel. That seemed to work really well. But my point is that to question this point about the growth of the aviation fuel demand, maybe flights, but not fuel demand, in that I was talking about 30 odd years ago, but I did a talk about such things a few years ago. I was astonished to find that the UK market, when I knew it, was about 11 million tonnes of jet fuel, and was still about 11 million tonnes of jet fuel 30 odd years later, with more efficient aircraft, better load factors, bigger aircraft, and all the rest of it. So I'm querying really it's in no way queries the incentive to get things right and do things properly that you so aptly described. But there was a figure of would be some big percentage of the CO2 target. And is that a bit misleading in terms of how the aviation market itself might grow?
I think what you're referring to, and thank you for your fascinating background as well. Sure, yeah. This feels quite close to the bone. So this is taken, I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, I won't share it, but I'll just read it to you. By 2050, aviation could consume 1/4 of the total global carbon budget.
That was the budget.
Global warming at 1.5 degrees. So I think in very simple terms, but if we have this amount of carbon dioxide that we can emit into the atmosphere with a high degree of probability that we will maintain global warming at only 1.5 degrees, that come 2050, because of, I think it could be misleading because it implies that the aviation is necessarily going to grow the amount of carbon emissions that it creates. In fact, it is expected to hold steady or increase slightly, but everyone else is declining. I think that's the key point. So it's a larger part of a smaller pie, if you like. So I think what it does do is remind us of the simple fact that this is a very hard to abate industry. It's extremely hard to abate. There are others, as I mentioned, concrete, steel manufacturing, because of the need for very high heat coming into steel manufacturing. There are others that are hard to abate. Shipping is very hard to abate. Aviation is one of those that's hard to abate. I think that's the point that it's making. It's not saying that emissions are going to go through the sky or through the roof. It's just very hard to reduce it. But thank you. That was a valid pushback on some of those things. Okay, time for.
I think we'll probably fit in another. I'll go Peter Latham and then Colin George after Peter.
Yeah. Anecdotally, and from questionnaires given to people, the indication is that business travel won't rise to anything like the level that we've experienced in the past. Official statistics seem to contradict this. As a psychologist, what's your answer to that?
Well, that's why I found that's why I found the McKinsey report interesting, but slightly having it two ways, which I hope there's no one who worked for McKinsey, but I think McKinsey sometimes do this. They sort of say what they want to be, what others want to hear. But they did predict a full recovery of corporate travel by 2024. That was their first statement. Their second statement was, our survey has found that many companies are adopting different ways of working. So, and they never really unpacked that. So I have to take it a little bit with a pinch of salt, because it just seems slightly dichotomous. I think what did resonate for me, Peter, is this idea that there is, and they put a number on it, they say 60%, which again, heaven knows where they got that number. 60% of people will return, or business travelers will return to business travel because they think that others are as well. There's this fear of missing out, this sense that we don't want to be the first law firm to say, stop traveling to see your clients, because other law firms will certainly not follow suit. So I think that did resonate with me McKinsey report that could drive business travel back up to where it was. I think there is a little bit that it could rise quite steeply from a bit more behavioral psychology perspective. Just as people, there's a sense of recovering lost time. So just as I mentioned, visiting the grandchild that's just been born, I think there will be a lot of return to business travel simply just to reconnect either with our teams, our colleagues that we're working with, conferences, sales fairs that haven't been able to happen. Perhaps those sorts of travel that actually, to be honest, were very difficult to do on a Zoom basis. And there is something, and there always will be something special about meeting face to face. We all know that, but maybe that will push business travel back up, and maybe that's what's behind the McKinsey data as well. But yeah, I think it'd be an interesting one to see. Final point from a behavior perspective: we are creatures of habit. So I think if we were traveling before, we could very easily start traveling again without really giving it much thought.
Having said that, we are now very used to Zoom calls as well. So, there's a habit that may be ingrained because we've been doing it for a lot longer than we thought we were going to, perhaps. But anyway, Colin, just to round off quickly.
Yeah, it was just a hope, really, that the work you're doing, Nick, will actually be seen by companies as part of their total cultural changes in relation to zero carbon, and they won't just see this as a one-off aspect, which gets put into the the company's handbook as policy for what you do when you've got to make a choice about visiting a client, because it is a whole culture issue, isn't it? And companies will have to think about zero carbon as a whole culture in terms of their product development, their marketing, their travel, and every aspect of the employees' lives and decisions processes in their companies. So it's just a statement of hope, really, and good luck to you.
Thank you. You said it beautifully, better than I did. So thank you. As I said, I'm very keen to report back at some point.
Thank you. James, Barry wanted to just dive in very quickly. I know I said one more, but 1.5.
I did put my hand up, but anyway, we're looking at it from the position now. The situation is going to hot up. So if we look at it and how attitudes are going to change in the next few years, is it not possible that companies themselves will start to take an attitude where the management will consider face-to-face meetings as less and less necessary, and maybe even get to the position where anybody who insists on a face-to-face meeting might find themselves in a less favorable position because they are not helping to keep the planet going. So the whole philosophy could perhaps reverse itself with good marketing. What do you think?
I think there's evidence to be hopeful on that front. I think in many changes, whether they're societal or economic or in business or politics, they don't happen on a sort of slow iterative basis. You get to these tipping points where suddenly things change and you're looking back and thinking, well, where did that come from? Why then? Why now? It could be that we are approaching a tipping point. I think you were looking at COP26. I think if that delivers what I think a lot of people hope it will deliver, then that could provoke the kind of, I hate to say it, but maybe the way we'll think of aviation in 10, 20 years will be a little bit like the way we used to think about smoking. Some people say that. I think it, personally, I struggle with that image because I think there are huge benefits for, aviation brings benefits. It's hard to think of benefits of smoking. Aviation does genuinely bring benefits, but a sense that it will be seen not just as a quote unquote public good. It has costs, and we have to think very hard about when we use this tool in our businesses, rather than, as Jim said earlier, it's just part of how we do things around there. So I'd like to be positive and I'd like to be hopeful, as you say, James. And my part is a very small part in just helping companies hopefully think differently about the issues you well described.
That's
probably quite a good place to end, eh?
That's a great place to end, and thank you all for your contributions, as well as thank you, Nick. I think on the subject of tipping points, one of them may have quite recently happened, in that the world's largest asset manager by assets under management, BlackRock, has publicly said that they will only invest in companies that have a good ESG score. And your ESG score is your environmental, social, and governance score. Your environmental is your first one. So the E is the most important one of ESG. And so companies then have to evidence and provide metrics of what they are doing in order to get a high ESG score, so that the big asset managers will invest in them. And that's quite a big change, because they used to just invest in stuff that made the most money. And now they've moved to this sort of more socially aware methodology behind their investments. And that's going to have quite a big impact, along with what Nick's doing, of course.
I would like to say that, you know, me and BlackRock together. Can I just one very, very small final point? BlackRock is a very, you'll know, it's a very, very financially astute organization. It's not making this decision purely on hugging the planet grounds. It's making it actually on it makes financial sense grounds. They see that companies that are taking this issue seriously are the ones that are going to cope better with the kind of climate impacts that we're likely to see down the line. They're managing their risk more effectively. I've heard lots of people say, when I go and talk to businesses about climate change, I don't talk to them about climate change. I talk to them about risk. That's when they listen. So, yeah.
That's without risking overrunning any more. I think at this point, I'd just like to thank you all one last time. And also, if you have a glass handy, I'd like to raise a glass to health of Her Majesty the Queen and to Rotarians the world over.
Yes.
On that note, thank you all very much for coming this evening, or not, actually staying where you are, even better. And we look forward to seeing you again. And here's a round of applause for Nick. Cheers. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Nice to join you.
Thank you, Nick.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Goodbye.
All right.